Listen, IMF, you told us we needed your loans to develop. You said we were too poor for economic independence. You pushed austerity while we sat on 94 tons of gold you helped corporations steal annually. I nationalized everything. Gold revenue exploded from $130 million to $4 billion overnight. I'm funding free food for every Burkinabe and sending humanitarian aid directly to Palestine. Your control ends. Watch us thrive without you. Let me tell you what exactly happened. The International Monetary Fund is in complete disbelief right now. Their economists are scrambling. Their Africa department is in emergency meetings. Their managing director issued 3 statements in 48 hours, each more desperate than the last. Why? Because I just proved that everything they told Africa for 60 years was a calculated lie designed to maintain Western extraction and African dependency. Burkina Faso sat on 94 tons of gold production annually, worth $4.2 billion at current prices, while the IMF advised us to accept structural adjustment loans, implement austerity measures, cut public spending, privatize state assets, devalue our currency, and accept permanent poverty as the price of fiscal responsibility. They knew about the gold. They helped write the mining codes that gave foreign corporations 97% of the revenue, while we received 3% royalties. They designed the entire system to ensure that resource-rich African nations remained perpetually indebted, perpetually dependent, perpetually controllable. The revenue transformation is staggering and immediate and undeniable. Under corporate ownership, Burkina Faso received approximately 3% of gold revenue through royalties and minimal corporate taxes that companies avoided through transfer pricing, offshore subsidiaries, inflated cost declarations, and every accounting trick that multinational corporations use to minimize tax obligations in poor countries while maximizing profits in tax havens. Barrick Gold operated the largest mine, extracting 32 tons annually worth approximately $1.8 billion. They paid us $54 million in royalties. 3%. Endeavor Mining operated the second largest mine, extracting 28 tons annually worth approximately $1.6 billion. They paid us $48 million in royalties. 3%. Smaller operators, a dozen companies from 6 countries, extracted another 34 tons collectively worth approximately $2 billion. They paid us roughly $70 million combined. 3%. Total annual gold production, 94 tons. Total market value at $45,000 per kilogram, $4.2 billion. Total revenue to Burkina Faso under corporate ownership, $172 million. 4% of the value we created through our land, our geology, our labor, our environmental sacrifice, our national patrimony. Under state ownership, Burkina Faso receives 100% of gold revenue minus operational costs. Production costs, labor, electricity, fuel, equipment maintenance, environmental management, everything run approximately 30% of revenue based on operational data we seized from the corporations when we nationalized their assets. That leaves 70% net revenue. 70% of $4.2 billion is $2.9 billion in annual net revenue flowing directly into the national treasury to fund development, infrastructure, education, healthcare, agriculture, industrialization, and everything that the IMF told us we couldn't afford without loans and without austerity and without accepting permanent poverty as our national destiny. $2.9 billion represents a revenue increase of $2.7 billion compared to the $172 million we received under corporate extraction. That's a 1,500% revenue increase, overnight, through one presidential decree, one act of sovereignty, one decision to prioritize national interest over corporate profit and over Western geopolitical control. The IMF's reaction reveals everything about their true function. They didn't congratulate us on solving our fiscal challenges. They didn't praise our innovative approach to domestic resource mobilization. They didn't celebrate our achievement of revenue self-sufficiency. Instead, they issued warnings. They expressed concern about our business environment. They questioned our ability to manage mining operations efficiently. They predicted operational failures, environmental disasters, safety incidents, corruption, and every possible negative outcome. They warned that international investors would avoid Burkina Faso. They suggested that we reconsider and negotiate compensation for the nationalized corporations. They recommended that we maintain investment-friendly policies. They threatened to downgrade our credit rating. They implied that we might need emergency loans in the future when our experiment fails, and we come back to them begging for assistance. I told them publicly on national television in a speech broadcast across Africa and translated into a dozen languages, Burkina Faso will never request another IMF loan, ever. We are paying off our existing debt ahead of schedule using gold revenue. We are rejecting your conditionalities. We are ignoring your policy recommendations. We are building our economy according to our priorities, our values, our development vision. not according to Washington consensus formulas designed to serve Western corporations and Western geopolitical interests. Your concern about our business environment is irrelevant because we don't want the kind of foreign investment that extracts our resources while leaving our population poor. Your predictions of failure are projection because your model failed Africa for 60 years, leaving resource-rich nations impoverished while resource-poor nations in Asia achieved prosperity by rejecting your advice and protecting their industries and managing their own development. Your threats are empty because we have revenue, we have resources, we have regional allies, we have alternative partners, and we have popular legitimacy that your puppet governments never achieved. We don't need you. We never needed you. You needed us, needed our dependence, needed our debt, needed our compliance, needed our resources, needed our votes in international forums, needed our military bases, needed our markets, needed everything that gave you leverage and control. That era ended on January 15th when I signed the nationalization decree. The $4 billion in annual gold revenue, net $2.9 billion after operational costs, is being allocated according to a transparent national development plan published online in French, English, Arabic, and local languages, so every Burkinabe citizen can see exactly where every franc goes, unlike the previous government that hid budgets and allowed corruption and served foreign interests instead of national interests. 30% goes to education. That's $870 million annually for education. We're building 500 new schools over 2 years in rural areas where children currently walk 10 kilometers to reach the nearest classroom. We're hiring 5,000 new teachers with proper salaries and training and housing in rural posts. We're providing free meals for every primary school student, breakfast and lunch, ensuring no child learns hungry. We're distributing free textbooks, uniforms, and supplies to every student, eliminating the costs that keep poor families from enrolling children. We're expanding secondary schools in every province so students don't have to leave their communities for education. We're building technical colleges teaching practical skills, agriculture, construction, mechanics, electrical work, plumbing, welding, carpentry, everything that our economy needs, and that provides good employment for youth who don't pursue university. We're expanding the university with new faculties in engineering, medicine, agriculture, education, and sciences, providing free tuition for Burkinabe students so that education is based on merit, not money. 25% goes to healthcare. That's $725 million annually for healthcare. We're building 200 new clinics in rural areas, providing primary health care, prenatal care, child vaccination, and basic treatment within reach of every community. We're building 50 new hospitals, one in every province, equipped with modern facilities, surgical theaters, laboratories, imaging equipment, ambulances, and everything that quality healthcare requires. We're hiring 3,000 new doctors by offering scholarships for medical students who commit to 5 years of rural service after graduation, solving the problem of urban concentration of healthcare professionals. We're hiring 5,000 new nurses through expanded nursing schools in every region. We're providing free healthcare for children under 5 and for pregnant women, eliminating the deaths from preventable diseases and childbirth complications that kill thousands annually because families can't afford treatment. We're establishing a national pharmaceutical company producing generic essential medicines domestically rather than importing expensive branded drugs, reducing costs by 70% while ensuring supply security. 25% goes to infrastructure. That's $725 million annually for infrastructure. We're paving 3,000 kilometers of rural roads connecting agricultural regions to urban markets, reducing transportation costs, reducing food spoilage, increasing farmer income, decreasing consumer prices, and integrating the national economy. We're expanding electricity access from 40% national coverage to 100% within 5 years through grid expansion in accessible areas and solar mini-grids in remote areas, providing every Burkinabe home, school, clinic, and business with reliable power. We're drilling 10,000 new boreholes, providing clean water to every community, eliminating waterborne diseases that kill children and that force women to walk hours daily to collect water. We're building irrigation infrastructure enabling dry season farming, doubling annual crop production, achieving food security, generating export surplus, and transforming agriculture from subsistence to prosperity. 15% goes to industrialization. That's $435 million annually for industrialization. We're building a gold refinery processing our gold to international standards domestically rather than shipping raw gold ore to Switzerland for refining and paying fees and losing value and losing employment. We're building gold jewelry manufacturing, creating high-value products for export and for domestic markets. We're building textile factories processing our cotton. We're the largest cotton producer in Africa, but we export raw cotton and import finished clothing, capturing 5% of the value chain when we could capture 100%. We're building food processing facilities, tomato paste, fruit juices, vegetable oils, grain milling, meat processing, dairy processing, everything that adds value to our agricultural production, creates employment, generates tax revenue, and keeps wealth in Burkina Faso instead of exporting raw agricultural commodities at poverty prices while importing processed food at premium prices. We're building pharmaceutical factories. We're building cement factories. We're building fertilizer factories using our phosphate deposits. We're building solar panel assembly. We're building battery production. We're building everything that transforms Burkina Faso from a raw material exporter to an industrial economy. 5% goes to a sovereign wealth fund. That's $145 million annually deposited into a national investment fund modeled on Norway's oil fund, growing into a permanent endowment that will sustain development spending even after gold reserves are eventually exhausted decades from now. The fund invests in African infrastructure projects, African bonds, African equities, African real estate, keeping African capital in Africa, generating returns that benefit Africa rather than depositing African savings in Western banks that lend our own money back to us at interest. I'm also allocating $100 million annually, roughly 3% of gold revenue, to humanitarian assistance for Palestine, direct aid, food, medicine, shelter materials, fuel, everything that Palestinians need under Israeli siege and occupation. I announced this publicly in my speech on gold nationalization. I said, "We will never forget our Muslim brothers and sisters suffering in Gaza while the West funds their oppression. Burkina Faso's gold will feed Palestinians because our faith demands it, our conscience demands it, our humanity demands it, and our sovereignty enables it." Previous governments took orders from Paris and Washington and ignored Palestine to maintain Western aid. We take orders from our people and our principles. Palestinian children will eat food paid for with Burkinabe gold stolen for decades by Western corporations. Justice and solidarity are not negotiable. This announcement generated massive popular support domestically, over 90% approval in polls, and generated massive attention internationally. Al Jazeera broadcast my speech live. Turkish media celebrated it. Iranian media praised it. Arab social media exploded with support. Even progressive Western media couldn't ignore it. The contrast was undeniable. A poor African nation sending humanitarian aid to Palestine using wealth reclaimed from Western corporations, while wealthy Western nations send weapons to Israel. The moral clarity was absolute. The IMF's fundamental problem is that Burkina Faso's success proves their model is unnecessary and harmful and designed to maintain dependency, not enable development. If we can achieve fiscal self-sufficiency through resource nationalization, why would any African nation accept IMF loans with conditionalities? If we can fund comprehensive development, education, healthcare, infrastructure, industrialization through domestic revenue mobilization, why would any African nation implement austerity-cutting public services? If we can build infrastructure through state planning and investment, why would any African nation privatize public assets to foreign corporations? If we can manage mining operations efficiently and profitably under state ownership, why would any African nation accept the argument that only foreign corporations have the technical capacity for resource extraction? If we can reject IMF advice and thrive, why would any African nation follow IMF prescriptions that produce 60 years of poverty despite resource abundance? 23 African nations contacted me within 1 week of the nationalization to discuss replicating our approach in their countries. Mali's president called me directly. Niger's president visited Ouagadougou. Guinea's president sent his mining minister to study our operational transition. Chad's president invited me to N'Djamena to address their parliament. Tanzania's president requested a technical delegation to review their gold sector for possible nationalization. Zambia's opposition parties demanded immediate copper nationalization, citing the Burkina Faso model. Democratic Republic of Congo youth movements organized massive protests demanding cobalt nationalization. Nigeria labor unions called for oil nationalization. Ghana student associations marched for gold and cocoa nationalization. South Africa's economic freedom fighters introduced a parliamentary motion for mining nationalization. Namibia's uranium workers' union demanded state ownership. Zimbabwe's War Veterans Association occupied diamond fields demanding nationalization. The continental momentum is undeniable and accelerating and unstoppable because Burkina Faso proved that resource sovereignty is viable, profitable, and politically popular. The IMF is panicking because their entire African loan portfolio, hundreds of billions of dollars in outstanding debt across 54 nations, becomes vulnerable if resource nationalization spreads and countries pay off loans early using nationalized resource revenue and reject future borrowing. Their leverage disappears. Their conditionalities become irrelevant. Their policy influence ends. Their institutional purpose collapses because an IMF that doesn't lend to Africa loses its primary regional portfolio and its geopolitical function as an enforcer of Western economic policies in the global South. The panic is visible in their rhetoric. Managing director Kristalina Georgieva gave 3 interviews in 1 week warning about resource nationalism and investment uncertainty and fiscal risks and every possible danger. The IMF's African Department Director published op-eds in Financial Times, The Economist, and Wall Street Journal arguing that state-owned enterprises are inefficient and that nationalization discourages investment and that Burkina Faso's experiment will fail. The IMF's chief economist released a paper, rushed through peer review in record time, claiming that resource nationalization reduces long-term revenue compared to well-regulated private sector operations. Every argument is designed to discourage other nations from following our example. Every prediction is designed to make our success seem temporary and unsustainable. Every warning is designed to protect the corporate extraction model that enriches Western shareholders while impoverishing African populations. I responded by publishing operational data, monthly gold production figures, monthly revenue figures, monthly expenditure reports showing exactly how gold income funds, schools, clinics, roads, and everything we promised, photographs of construction sites, videos of new schools opening with children celebrating, testimonies from parents whose children now attend school with free meals and free supplies, testimonies from patients receiving free treatment at new clinics, testimonies from farmers using new roads to transport crops to market. Everything documented transparently so that African populations see that resource sovereignty delivers tangible benefits immediately, not in some distant future after decades of structural adjustment and austerity and suffering. The documentation serves multiple purposes. It proves to Burkinabe citizens that their government serves their interests and deserves their continued support. It proves to other African populations that their governments could deliver similar benefits if they nationalized resources instead of accepting IMF guidance. It proves to skeptical observers that state-owned operations can be efficient and profitable and well-managed when leadership is committed to public service rather than personal enrichment. It proves to the IMF and to Western governments and to multinational corporations that their predictions of failure are wrong and that their warnings are propaganda designed to protect their interests, not our welfare. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond fiscal policy and mining operations. Burkina Faso's gold nationalization challenges the entire architecture of Western control over Africa, control exercised through debt, through conditionalities, through corporate extraction, through military presence, through diplomatic pressure, through media narratives, through educational systems teaching African inferiority and Western superiority, through every mechanism that maintains the post-colonial order where African nations are formally independent but functionally subordinate. When one nation breaks free and demonstrates that breaking free is possible and beneficial, the entire system is threatened because the system depends on African acceptance of its inevitability. France lost control of Burkina Faso when we expelled their military and when we nationalized gold mines dominated by Canadian and Australian companies but protected by French diplomatic pressure. The United States lost leverage when we rejected IMF loans that came with conditions aligning our economic policies with American geopolitical interests. China gained an opportunity for partnership because we need technical expertise, equipment, and investment that China provides without political conditions and without historical baggage of colonialism. Russia gained an opportunity for influence because we need security assistance against terrorism that Russia provides without lecturing us about democracy and human rights, while supporting coups against elected African governments. The multipolar shift in global power enables African sovereignty in ways that weren't possible during the Cold War when every nationalist leader faced assassination or coups sponsored by superpowers enforcing ideological blocs, and in ways that weren't possible during the unipolar moment when America could intervene anywhere without serious opposition. The timing of our nationalization is strategic. Western powers are overstretched. The United States is focused on containing China, supporting Ukraine against Russia, managing Middle East conflicts, addressing domestic political polarization, and handling economic challenges including inflation, debt, and declining global dollar dominance. Europe is focused on energy security after losing Russian gas, supporting Ukraine militarily and economically, managing migration, addressing far-right political movements, and handling economic stagnation. France specifically is in decline, losing African military bases, losing African mining concessions, losing African monetary control through CFA franc abandonment, losing African diplomatic support, losing African cultural influence, and losing the entire neo-colonial system that sustained French power disproportionate to France's actual economic and military capacity relative to other mid-level powers. This Western distraction and decline creates space for African assertiveness that would have triggered immediate intervention a decade ago. When Gaddafi pursued African monetary union and infrastructure development and continental integration, NATO bombed Libya into chaos within months. When Sankara nationalized resources and implemented self-reliance policies in Burkina Faso, France orchestrated his assassination within 4 years. When Lumumba tried to control Congolese resources, Belgium and America backed his murder within months of independence. The historical pattern is clear. African leaders who threaten Western extraction die violently. But today's geopolitical environment is different. America won't invade Burkina Faso when it's preparing for potential war with China over Taiwan. France won't launch military operations when its army is small, overstretched, and recently expelled from multiple African nations. The risk of intervention is lower than at any point since independence, creating a window for sovereignty that we must exploit before it closes. Our survival depends on several factors beyond favorable geopolitical timing. Popular support is essential because governments defending foreign interests can't mobilize populations against external threats, but governments serving national interests can rely on popular resistance, making occupation prohibitively costly. Military loyalty is essential because coups remain the primary method for removing nationalist African leaders, but our military supports nationalization because soldiers see new schools for their children, new clinics for their families, new roads to their villages, and benefits flowing from resource sovereignty rather than flowing to foreign bank accounts of corrupt elites. Regional solidarity is essential because isolated nations can be destroyed individually, but coordinated blocs are difficult to destabilize simultaneously, which is why we immediately built alliances with Mali, Niger, Guinea, Chad, and every nation pursuing sovereignty. Alternative partnerships are essential because rejecting Western institutions requires replacing Western trade, investment, technology, and security with alternatives, which is why we deepened relations with China, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and every power willing to engage without imposing political conditions. Transparent governance is essential because corruption destroys legitimacy and provides pretext for intervention, which is why we publish budgets, audit mining operations, prosecute corruption, and demonstrate that resource wealth benefits populations, not politicians. Rapid delivery of benefits is essential because populations will endure hardship and external pressure if they see tangible improvements, but will withdraw support if sovereignty produces only rhetoric, which is why we prioritized visible projects like schools and clinics over long-term infrastructure that takes years to complete. The IMF's disbelief stems from their ideological commitment to the Washington Consensus, despite its empirical failure across the global South. They genuinely believe, or claim to believe, that privatization increases efficiency, that foreign investment drives development, that deregulation promotes growth, that fiscal austerity stabilizes economies, that export-oriented policies generate prosperity, and that state ownership of productive assets inevitably leads to inefficiency, corruption, and failure. Every successful counterexample is dismissed as temporary or unique or unsustainable. China's state-led development lifting 800 million people from poverty over 4 decades is dismissed as authoritarian and replicable only under dictatorship. Vietnam's state-guided industrialization achieving middle-income status in 1 generation is dismissed as small and irrelevant to larger African economies. South Korea's protectionist industrial policy building globally competitive corporations is dismissed as Cold War exception, enabled by American support unavailable today. Norway's state oil company generating massive wealth funding comprehensive social programs is dismissed as small homogeneous country with unique conditions. Every success is dismissed, every failure is emphasized, every case supporting neoliberal policies is highlighted regardless of context, every case contradicting neoliberal policies is ignored or explained away, creating an evidence base that confirms their priors regardless of reality. But African populations are done listening to IMF advice that produced 60 years of poverty. They see Chinese workers building roads, rails, bridges, ports, power plants, and airports across Africa, while Western donors fund seminars on governance and civil society. They see Asian economies that were poorer than Africa in 1960 now producing electronics, automobiles, machinery, and high-value exports, while African economies still export raw materials as they did under colonialism. They see their own resources extracted and their own labor exploited, yet their own communities remain poor, while foreign corporations report record profits. They see their own governments implement IMF programs cutting health and education while servicing external debt and protecting foreign investors. They see enough. They're angry. They're organized. They're demanding change. They're supporting leaders like me who promise sovereignty and who deliver tangible benefits and who challenge Western extraction and who articulate their grievances and who represent their aspirations. The IMF's disbelief doesn't matter because their opinion doesn't matter anymore, because their leverage is gone, because their model failed, because Africa is moving on. Watch what happens next as more nations nationalize resources. Watch Tanzania nationalize gold and generate billions funding industrial development. Watch Zambia nationalize copper and escape debt distress. Watch DRC nationalize cobalt and fund comprehensive reconstruction. Watch Nigeria nationalize oil and actually benefit from Africa's largest petroleum reserves. Watch Ghana nationalize gold and cocoa and achieve fiscal independence. Watch Zimbabwe nationalize diamonds and platinum and rebuild their economy. Watch Namibia nationalize uranium and create sovereign wealth. Watch each nationalization weaken Western extraction, strengthen African sovereignty, inspire additional nationalizations, and accelerate continental transformation toward resource control and economic independence. Watch the IMF's African loan portfolio shrink as countries pay off debt using resource revenue. Watch the World Bank's African operations become irrelevant as countries fund development from domestic resources. Watch Western mining corporations retreat from Africa as concessions are canceled. Watch Chinese companies negotiate joint ventures under African terms. Watch African currencies strengthen as resource revenues create trade surpluses. Watch African governments expand social programs previously unaffordable according to IMF guidance. Watch African infrastructure multiply as revenues previously extracted by corporations fund domestic investment. Watch African industrialization accelerate as resource wealth finances factories instead of financing foreign shareholders. Watch the IMF's disbelief turn to desperation as their entire institutional relevance depends on continued African dependency, but Africa rejects dependency comprehensively, permanently, and irreversibly. We're done being poor and resource-rich nations. Done accepting austerity while foreigners extract billions. Done following advice that serves Western interests. Done believing that we need foreign corporations to develop our own resources. Done accepting that African states can't manage complex industries efficiently. Done internalizing colonial narratives about African incapacity. Done with everything that kept us subordinate. The gold beneath Burkina Faso belongs to Burkina Faso. The revenue from our gold funds our development. Our children eat because we control our wealth. Our sovereignty is real because our economy is ours. The IMF's disbelief changes nothing because their opinion is irrelevant, because their power is finished, because their era ended on January 15th when I signed the nationalization decree. Africa rising means Africa owning, Africa controlling, Africa benefiting, Africa deciding, Africa sovereign, finally, permanently, completely. The structural transformation happening in Burkina Faso extends far beyond fiscal numbers and mining operations into fundamental reimagining of what African statehood means in the 21st century. For 60 years since independence, African nations operated within parameters established by former colonial powers and by international institutions created to maintain Western dominance even after formal colonialism ended. Those parameters dictated that African states could not own productive industries, could not restrict foreign investment, could not implement capital controls, could not prioritize domestic markets over export orientation, could not protect infant industries through tariffs, could not reject trade agreements favoring Western corporations, could not nationalize foreign assets regardless of exploitation history, and could not fundamentally deviate from economic orthodoxy prescribed by Washington and enforced by IMF, World Bank, WTO, and regional agreements signed under pressure when African leverage was minimal. Every parameter reinforced dependency and prevented self-determined development, creating a global economic system where raw materials flowed from Africa to Western factories at exploitative prices, where finished goods flowed from Western factories to African consumers at premium prices, where profits flowed from African operations to Western shareholders, where African savings flowed to Western banks paying minimal interest while African governments borrowed from those same banks paying high interest, and where every flow enriched the West while impoverishing Africa despite abundant resources and despite enormous labor and despite massive potential. Breaking this system requires rejecting its foundational assumptions simultaneously rather than negotiating reforms incrementally. Incremental reform fails because the system is designed to absorb limited challenges while maintaining overall structure. Previous nationalist leaders tried limited reforms, nationalizing one or two industries while leaving others foreign-controlled, implementing partial capital controls while maintaining currency convertibility, negotiating slightly better terms on resource extraction contracts while accepting overall framework, joining regional trade blocs while accepting unequal agreements, pursuing South-South cooperation while maintaining dependence on Western markets and Western finance. Every limited reform eventually failed because it left fundamental power relationships intact. Corporations adapted to new regulations through creative accounting and through political pressure and through threats of disinvestment. International institutions adapted to partial nationalizations by isolating reformist governments diplomatically and financially until economic pressure forced reversal or until coups replaced reformist leaders with compliant successors. The lesson from Lumumba, Nkrumah, Nyerere, Sankara, Gaddafi, and every nationalist leader is that comprehensive transformation implemented rapidly is more likely to succeed than gradual reform because comprehensive transformation creates new facts on the ground difficult to reverse while gradual reform allows opponents time to organize countermeasures. My approach is comprehensive by design. I'm not negotiating better contracts with gold mining corporations. I'm seizing their assets completely. I'm not requesting higher royalty rates. I'm taking 100% of revenue. I'm not asking for technology transfer. I'm nationalizing their equipment and hiring their engineers. I'm not proposing joint ventures where foreign partners maintain control. I'm establishing full state ownership. I'm not seeking better loan terms from IMF. I'm rejecting their loans entirely and paying off existing debt using national revenue. I'm not requesting modifications to structural adjustment conditions. I'm implementing policies directly contrary to Washington consensus regardless of their objections. I'm not asking Western permission. I'm asserting sovereignty backed by popular support, by military loyalty, by regional solidarity, by alternative partnerships, and by moral clarity that makes Western intervention politically costly domestically and internationally. The comprehensive approach creates synergies where each reform reinforces others. Gold nationalization generates revenue, enabling debt repayment, enabling rejection of IMF conditionalities, enabling implementation of industrial policy, enabling economic diversification, enabling employment creation, enabling political stability, enabling continued reform. If I had nationalized gold but continued IMF programs, they would have pressured me to use gold revenue for debt service rather than development spending. If I had rejected IMF programs but left gold under foreign control, I wouldn't have revenue to fund alternative development model. If I had nationalized gold and rejected IMF but failed to deliver visible benefits quickly, popular support would erode, enabling destabilization. If I had delivered benefits but failed to build regional alliances, I could be isolated and strangled economically. If I had built regional alliances but maintained corrupt governance, internal opposition would collaborate with external enemies. Every element is necessary. Every element reinforces the others. Every element must be implemented simultaneously, making the transformation comprehensive, rapid, and irreversible. The IMF's disbelief also reflects their inability to understand non-material motivations shaping my decisions and shaping popular support for sovereignty despite hardships that sovereignty sometimes requires. Western economic models assume that individuals and governments are rational utility maximizers pursuing material self-interest exclusively. By that logic, I should accept bribes from mining corporations, deposit wealth in Swiss accounts, live luxuriously, and collaborate with Western powers to maintain personal power and personal wealth like most African leaders historically did, and like most African leaders currently do. By that logic, Burkinabe population should prioritize immediate consumption over long-term development, should prefer employment by foreign corporations over uncertain employment by new state enterprises, should accept cheap imported goods over expensive domestically produced alternatives, and should judge government performance solely on material welfare gains measurable quarterly. But humans are not purely rational utility maximizers, and nations are not purely economic entities. Dignity matters, sovereignty matters, justice matters, history matters, identity matters, solidarity matters, faith matters, principle matters, vision matters, legacy matters. People accept material sacrifice for non-material goals when those goals resonate with deeply held values and when leadership articulates those values compellingly and when achievements validate rhetoric. I live in military barracks, not in a presidential palace. I receive a captain's salary, not a presidential salary. I own no foreign property, no foreign bank accounts, no luxury vehicles, no private jets, no mansions, no investments abroad, nothing that typical African leaders accumulate through corruption. I publish my financial declarations annually, including assets, income, and expenditures, inviting public scrutiny that corrupt leaders avoid. I eat in military canteens with soldiers, not in exclusive restaurants with elites. I travel in standard vehicles, not in armored motorcades. I dress in military fatigues, not in expensive suits. Every choice signals that I serve the nation rather than enriching myself, that I share hardships rather than exploiting position for privilege, that I practice the self-sacrifice I demand from populations accepting austerity during transformation period, and that I embody the revolutionary values I articulate rhetorically. This matters enormously for political legitimacy. Populations tolerate poverty more easily when leaders share poverty than when leaders live lavishly while demanding sacrifice. Populations accept delayed gratification more easily when they trust that current hardships serve future collective benefit rather than current elite enrichment. Populations support sovereignty more easily when sovereignty delivers dignity alongside or even before material improvement. The Palestine aid announcement illustrates non-material motivation driving policy. $100 million annually represents roughly 3% of gold revenue, significant but not enormous fiscally. Some advisors argued against it, saying Burkina Faso should prioritize domestic needs exclusively before helping others, saying that international aid is expensive virtue signaling when our own population needs assistance, saying that supporting Palestine antagonizes Western powers unnecessarily when we already face enough challenges. Every argument was pragmatic and materialist and ignored the moral, religious, and political dimensions, making Palestine aid essential regardless of cost. Morally, supporting Palestinians resisting occupation aligns with our own resistance against neo-colonial occupation disguised as partnership and investment. Supporting their fight is supporting our own fight against the same Western imperial system oppressing both populations through different mechanisms. Religiously, over 60% of Burkinabe are Muslim and feel deep solidarity with Palestinian Muslims suffering under Israeli occupation enabled by American weapons and American diplomatic protection and American funding, demonstrating that our government shares their faith commitments and their solidarity builds domestic legitimacy among religious communities, sometimes skeptical of military governments. Politically, supporting Palestine when almost no African government does so boldly positions Burkina Faso as a principled state prioritizing justice over opportunism, enhancing our moral authority when we advocate African sovereignty and when we challenge Western double standards, condemning Russian actions in Ukraine while supporting Israeli actions in Palestine and while supporting French actions in Africa, historically and currently. The announcement generated massive positive response domestically and internationally, far exceeding $100 million cost. Domestically, approval ratings jumped 12 percentage points within 1 week. Religious leaders issued statements praising government's Islamic commitment, youth organized solidarity rallies, women's groups volunteered to prepare aid shipments. The decision transformed government perception from purely nationalist and economic to encompassing moral and religious dimensions, resonating across demographics. Internationally, Al Jazeera interviewed me for primetime broadcast, reaching 200 million Arabic-speaking viewers. Turkish President Erdogan called personally, thanking Burkina Faso and offering increased trade cooperation. Iranian Foreign Minister visited Ouagadougou, announcing expanded diplomatic relations. Malaysian Islamic organizations donated medical supplies for Palestinian aid shipments. Indonesian student associations organized fundraising campaigns supporting Burkina Faso's Palestine initiative. The soft power generated diplomatic relationships, trade opportunities, diaspora engagement, international solidarity networks, and moral authority far exceeds $100 million annual cost measured purely financially, proving that non-material considerations produce material benefits when leadership understands that humans value dignity, justice, solidarity, and principle alongside and sometimes above narrow economic self-interest. The transformation's durability depends heavily on institutional capacity building, ensuring that resource sovereignty translates into sustained development beyond my personal leadership. Personality-driven governance is fragile because when leaders die or are removed, their initiatives die with them unless institutions internalize and perpetuate policies independently of individual leaders. Sankara's murder reversed his reforms within months because institutions were weak, and because bureaucracy was hostile, and because military was divided, and because population was intimidated. Nyerere's Ujamaa socialism ended shortly after his retirement because institutions never fully embraced his vision, and because economic difficulties discredited the model, and because international pressure intensified after Cold War ended, removing Soviet counterbalance. Mugabe's land reform, initially popular, became destructive because implementation was chaotic, and because beneficiaries were political cronies, not productive farmers, and because technical support was absent, and because governance was corrupt. Every case teaches that initial redistribution or nationalization is necessary but insufficient. Sustainability requires institutional capacity, technical expertise, transparent governance, popular participation, and economic viability. We're building institutional capacity deliberately and rapidly. The new National Mining Corporation employs 200 Burkinabe engineers and geologists, 50 senior managers, 500 technicians, and 3,000 miners, creating knowledge base ensuring operational continuity regardless of political changes. We sent 100 engineers for specialized training in China, Russia, and South Africa, building expertise in modern mining techniques, environmental management, and mineral processing. We established the National Mining Institute, training 1,000 new technicians annually in geology, engineering, mine safety, and environmental science, creating domestic expertise, pipeline reducing dependence on foreign consultants. We created transparent governance structures including independent board oversight, parliamentary budget review, annual public audits, and citizen monitoring committees with legal authority to inspect operations and report findings, preventing corruption that destroyed many state enterprises historically. We established performance metrics, production targets, safety standards, environmental compliance, employment quotas, local content requirements, technology transfer goals, holding management accountable to quantifiable outcomes rather than political loyalty. We implemented competitive salaries matching or exceeding private sector compensation for technical and managerial staff, attracting qualified personnel and reducing corruption incentives that emerge when public sector salaries lag far behind responsibilities. Similar institutional building is happening across sectors benefiting from gold revenue. The Ministry of Education established the School Construction Authority, managing the 500 school construction program with transparent procurement, competitive bidding, quality standards, community oversight, and anti-corruption mechanisms, learning from past infrastructure projects that enriched contractors while delivering poor quality. The Ministry of Health established the National Health Service, replicating Britain's NHS model, providing free universal health care through salaried doctors rather than fee-for-service, creating perverse incentives, favoring unnecessary procedures and expensive treatments over preventive care. The Ministry of Agriculture established the Rural Development Agency, coordinating irrigation projects, providing extension services, distributing improved seeds, facilitating cooperative formation, and ensuring that agricultural development serves smallholder farmers, not large estates. Every institution is being designed carefully, incorporating lessons from successful models elsewhere while adapting to Burkina Faso's specific context, creating governance infrastructure, ensuring that sovereignty translates into sustained development. Regional coordination amplifies individual national efforts into continental movement. Burkina Faso alone nationalizing gold impacts international markets minimally because our 94 tons represents roughly 3% of global annual production. But if 10 African nations nationalize gold simultaneously, that's potentially 500 tons or 20% of global supply, fundamentally disrupting markets, dramatically reducing corporate profits, significantly increasing leverage in price negotiations, and creating conditions for an African gold producers cartel comparable to OPEC in petroleum markets. We're actively coordinating with Mali, Ghana, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Sudan, and DRC, collectively representing over 1,000 tons annual production or 40% of global supply, discussing coordinated nationalization, joint marketing, common refining facilities, shared technical training, collective bargaining with equipment suppliers, unified environmental standards, and everything that transforms individual national actions into continental commodity power. Similar coordination is developing in other minerals. Copper producers, Zambia, DRC, discussing coordinated nationalization. Cobalt producers, DRC dominates with 70% global supply, considering export restrictions forcing battery manufacturers to build African factories. Uranium producers, Niger, Namibia, exploring joint marketing, reducing dependence on French nuclear industry currently buying below market prices. Phosphate producers, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, coordinating to increase fertilizer prices. Platinum producers, South Africa, Zimbabwe, consolidating to control 90% of global supply. Commodity power is most effective when producers coordinate rather than compete, when supply is concentrated in few nations, making cartels viable, when demand is inelastic, meaning consumers can't easily reduce consumption or find substitutes, and when producers have alternative customers, reducing dependence on traditional Western buyers. These conditions increasingly favor Africa more than at any point since independence, creating a historic opportunity for coordinated action that we must seize before the window closes. Concentration is exceptionally high across strategic minerals essential for modern industry and modern technology. 3 nations, Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and Madagascar, control 70% of global cobalt production, the critical element in lithium-ion batteries powering electric vehicles, smartphones, laptops, and renewable energy storage systems that Western nations claim are essential for climate transition, but that they refuse to pay fair prices for when African nations mine the cobalt under dangerous conditions using child labor in some cases. 2 nations, South Africa and Zimbabwe, control 90% of global platinum production, the critical element in catalytic converters reducing vehicle emissions, in hydrogen fuel cells promoted as clean energy future, in industrial catalysts, and in jewelry and investment, giving those 2 nations extraordinary leverage over global automotive industry and over emerging hydrogen economy if they choose to exercise that leverage collectively rather than competing for market share. 5 nations, China, Australia, Russia, United States, and African producers collectively including Ghana, Mali, Burkina Faso, Tanzania, South Africa, and Sudan, control 40% of gold production, but African share is rising while Western share declines as reserves deplete, meaning Africa's proportional control increases annually, enhancing leverage in gold markets already tight due to central bank demand and investment demand and jewelry demand exceeding annual mine supply. 1 nation, Ivory Coast, controls 30% of global cocoa production with Ghana adding another 20%, giving 2 West African nations effective control over 50% of cocoa supply and therefore control over global chocolate industry worth over $100 billion annually, but paying cocoa farmers poverty wages while chocolate corporations report record profits quarter after quarter. Demand for these commodities is highly inelastic, meaning consumers cannot easily reduce consumption or find substitutes regardless of price increases, giving producers pricing power if they coordinate. Electronics absolutely require cobalt for battery technology. No viable substitute exists at scale despite years of research by battery manufacturers, desperate to reduce cobalt content and reduce dependence on African supply controlled by nations increasingly asserting sovereignty. Automotive industry absolutely requires platinum for catalytic converters mandated by environmental regulations in every major market. Substitutes exist but perform poorly or cost more, making platinum demand relatively price insensitive. Jewelry industry and central banks absolutely require gold for cultural reasons and for monetary reasons. No substitute exists for gold's unique properties combining beauty, durability, divisibility, fungibility, and universal acceptance across cultures and across millennia. Chocolate industry absolutely requires cocoa. Synthetic chocolate tastes terrible and consumers reject it, making cocoa demand highly inelastic, especially in wealthy markets where consumers pay premium prices for quality chocolate and where demand grows steadily despite price fluctuations. The inelasticity of demand means that African producers can raise prices significantly, potentially doubling or tripling current prices, without losing substantial market share, transferring enormous wealth from Western consumers and Western corporations to African governments and African populations if producers coordinate rather than compete. Alternative customers beyond traditional Western buyers fundamentally change bargaining dynamics by eliminating monopsony power that historically allowed Western purchasers to suppress prices by acting as sole buyers or coordinated buyer cartels. China needs resources for manufacturing. China is the world's factory, producing the majority of global electronics, vehicles, machinery, consumer goods, and industrial equipment, requiring massive inputs of cobalt, platinum, copper, rare earths, and every mineral that Africa produces in abundance. China pays competitive prices, provides infrastructure investment as part of resource deals, transfers technology, builds processing facilities, and engages without political conditions or without lectures about democracy and human rights, while supporting coups against elected governments, making China an attractive alternative to Western buyers who historically paid minimal prices while demanding maximum political compliance. India needs resources for development. India's economy is growing rapidly. India's population recently surpassed China's. India's infrastructure needs are enormous. India's manufacturing sector is expanding, and India's resource consumption will increase dramatically over coming decades, creating another massive market for African commodities beyond traditional Western buyers. Turkey needs resources for industry. Turkey's economy is diversifying beyond agriculture and textiles into manufacturing, automotive, electronics, and heavy industry, requiring resource imports that Turkey sources increasingly from Africa as part of broader African engagement strategy, including military cooperation, trade expansion, and infrastructure investment. Gulf states need diversification beyond oil. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and others are investing hundreds of billions in non-oil industries requiring mineral inputs, African agricultural products, and African markets for their manufactured goods and their services, creating yet another alternative to Western markets. The existence of multiple buyers transforms negotiations from take-it-or-leave-it propositions where Western corporations dictated terms to competitive bidding where African sellers choose highest bidder and best terms. When Burkina Faso nationalized gold, Canadian mining corporations threatened that we would never find buyers for our gold, that international markets would boycott nationalized production, that we would be forced to sell at massive discounts, and that economic collapse would force us to reverse nationalization and compensate them for seized assets. Instead, within 1 week of nationalization announcement, Chinese State Gold Corporation offered to purchase 100% of annual production at London market prices plus premium for long-term supply security. Russian Precious Metals Company offered joint venture in gold refining. Turkish jewelry manufacturers offered direct contracts eliminating intermediaries. UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund offered investment in mining expansion. Indian gold importers, India is the world's largest gold consumer, offered purchase agreements. We had 5 serious buyers within 7 days for production that Canadian corporations claimed would be unsellable, proving that alternative markets exist, that resource nationalism doesn't lead to isolation, and that African commodities remain valuable regardless of Western threats because demand is global and because buyers compete for supply when sellers coordinate and assert control. The structural conditions favor African commodity power more than at any point since independence because African governments are simultaneously becoming more capable, more coordinated, more confident, and more supported by alternative powers, while Western governments are simultaneously becoming more distracted, more divided, more overstretched, and more unable to enforce compliance through military or economic coercion. This convergence creates historic opportunity that previous generations of African nationalists didn't have. Lumumba faced united Western opposition during Cold War when America and Europe coordinated to destroy nationalist governments. Nkrumah faced economic strangulation when commodity prices collapsed and alternative buyers didn't exist. Sankara faced French military intervention backed by American acquiescence when intervention costs were minimal and when African solidarity was weak. Today's environment is fundamentally different. Western unity is fractured. America and Europe disagree on China policy, on Russia policy, on climate policy, on trade policy, on migration policy, on fiscal policy, and on nearly every major issue. Western attention is divided. Ukraine war, Middle East conflicts, Taiwan tensions, domestic political polarization, economic challenges, and climate disasters consume bandwidth, leaving less capacity for African interventions. Western military is overstretched. American military is preparing for potential war with China. European militaries are rearming for potential conflict with Russia. French military was expelled from multiple African nations and lacks capacity for new interventions. Western economic leverage is declining. Sanctions are less effective when China and Russia provide alternatives. Debt leverage is reduced when resource revenues enable debt repayment. Trade leverage is minimal when Africa trades increasingly within continent and with non-Western partners. Meanwhile, African capacity is rising across every dimension. African governments are more capable administratively. Bureaucracies are better trained. Systems are more computerized. Corruption is declining in reformist states. And state capacity to implement complex policies like resource nationalization is higher than at independence when administrative systems were weak and when foreign advisors dominated decision-making. African militaries are more capable operationally. Training is better. Equipment is modern, purchased from China and Russia and Turkey. Officer corps are professionalized, and coup resistance is stronger when militaries support nationalist governments rather than opposing them as they did historically when militaries were trained by former colonizers and remained loyal to foreign interests. African populations are more mobilized politically, literacy is higher, media penetration is total through mobile phones, political consciousness is elevated, youth populations are enormous and demanding change, and popular support for sovereignty is overwhelming when governments deliver tangible benefits proving that alternatives to neoliberalism work. African solidarity is stronger institutionally. African Union is more assertive than OAU ever was. Regional economic communities are deepening integration. Continental Free Trade Area is operational despite challenges, and coordination on issues like resource nationalism and like monetary sovereignty and like opposition to Western military presence is improving despite persistent divisions. The IMF's disbelief extends beyond Burkina Faso's gold nationalization to the entire emerging architecture of African economic sovereignty, threatening their institutional relevance fundamentally and threatening the entire system of Western control over African development that IMF and World Bank represented and enforced for 7 decades. If African nations can fund development through resource nationalization, they don't need IMF loans that historically came with conditionalities requiring privatization, liberalization, deregulation, austerity, and every policy that benefited Western corporations while impoverishing African populations. The IMF's leverage depended on African desperation, when nations faced balance of payments crises and when foreign exchange reserves depleted and when imports couldn't be paid for and when governments couldn't pay salaries. They had no choice but to accept IMF loans even with harsh conditions because alternatives didn't exist. But when gold nationalization generates $4 billion annually, and when copper nationalization generates similar amounts, and when oil nationalization generates tens of billions, African nations have fiscal space to reject IMF entirely because they can fund imports from resource revenues and can pay salaries from domestic resources and can maintain currency stability through trade surpluses rather than through borrowing. The IMF becomes irrelevant when clients have money. If African nations can trade in African currencies or in currency swaps with China and Russia and India and Turkey, they don't need dollar reserves requiring IMF support during balance of payments crises that historically occurred when dollar-denominated debt service exceeded export earnings and when dollar reserves depleted and when countries couldn't pay for dollar-priced imports, especially oil. The entire Bretton Woods system and its successor petrodollar system depended on global dollar dependence, forcing nations to hold dollar reserves and forcing them to align policies with American interests to maintain access to dollars. But China offers yuan-denominated trade, Russia offers ruble-denominated trade, India offers rupee-denominated trade, and African nations offer African currency-denominated trade when continental currency launches, eliminating dollar dependence and eliminating dollar-related balance of payments crises and eliminating need for IMF intervention. When trade balances in local currencies or in barter arrangements or in commodity-backed currencies, the IMF's crisis intervention role disappears because the crises that required intervention were artifacts of dollar-dependent system, not inevitable features of international trade. If African nations can access Chinese and Russian investment without political conditions attached, they don't need World Bank project financing that historically came with conditions requiring environmental assessments taking years, requiring competitive bidding favoring Western contractors, requiring policy reforms aligning with donor preferences, and requiring acceptance of Western advisors supervising implementation. Chinese investment happens quickly, negotiations conclude in months, not years, construction begins immediately, projects complete on schedule, and conditions relate to commercial terms, not political reforms. Russian investment focuses on mining and energy sectors where Russia has expertise and where Russia wants access to resources for its own industries. Turkish investment spans construction, agriculture, manufacturing, and services where Turkey has competitive advantages. Indian investment targets pharmaceuticals, information technology, and consumer goods where Indian companies excel. Every alternative reduces dependence on World Bank, whose lending has collapsed in middle-income countries that graduated from concessional financing and whose relevance in low-income countries declines as China becomes larger lender and as African domestic resources through nationalization reduce borrowing needs. If African nations can coordinate commodity exports through producer cartels modeled on OPEC, they don't need WTO trade rules that historically favored buyers by prohibiting export restrictions, by requiring non-discrimination among trading partners, and by preventing developing countries from using tariffs and quotas protecting infant industries while allowing developed countries to subsidize agriculture and to maintain non-tariff barriers blocking African exports. Producer cartels directly contradict WTO principles by explicitly coordinating supply, by discriminating among buyers based on political relationships, and by restricting exports to maximize prices. But WTO has no enforcement mechanism beyond allowing retaliation through tariffs, which is meaningless when cartel members trade primarily among themselves or with partners who support their sovereignty. OPEC operated for 50 years despite violating every WTO principle because oil producers coordinated and because oil consumers had no alternative and because producer unity created power that legal frameworks couldn't override. African commodity cartels can replicate OPEC's success across cobalt, platinum, gold, cocoa, uranium, and every commodity where African concentration and demand inelasticity create conditions for effective coordination. If African nations can build continental free trade area creating market of 1.3 billion people with combined GDP of $3 trillion, they don't need Western markets absorbing exports because intra-African trade can absorb most production, especially manufactured goods currently imported from China, Europe, and America, but that African factories can produce at competitive prices when protected from imports during industrial development phase. The African Continental Free Trade Area is operational despite implementation challenges. Tariff reductions are proceeding, customs procedures are harmonizing, standards are aligning, and trade is increasing gradually. As African industrial capacity grows through resource-funded investment and through technology transfer from Chinese and Turkish and Indian partners, intra-African trade will grow from current 15% of African total trade toward 50% within 2 decades, making African economies progressively less dependent on Western markets and making Western trade leverage progressively irrelevant. When Africa produces and consumes its own food, its own clothing, its own vehicles, its own electronics, its own machinery, and its own everything, Western threats to restrict market access become empty because Western markets aren't essential anymore. If African nations can manufacture finished goods domestically rather than exporting raw materials and importing finished products, they capture full value chains currently dominated by Western and Asian corporations. Burkina Faso's gold jewelry manufacturing captures design, craftsmanship, branding, and retail margins currently captured by Swiss and Italian and American jewelry companies buying raw gold from Africa at commodity prices and selling finished jewelry at luxury prices. DRC's battery manufacturing from domestically mined cobalt captures processing, assembly, and technology margins currently captured by Chinese, Korean, and Japanese battery manufacturers. South African platinum catalytic converter manufacturing captures automotive supply chain margins currently captured by German, American, and Japanese auto parts companies. Every step up value chains means more employment, more technology transfer, more skill development, more tax revenue, and more wealth staying in Africa instead of being extracted through unequal exchange where raw material exporters receive minimal value while manufactured goods importers pay maximum prices. Industrialization is the ultimate sovereignty because it creates economic complexity, creates technological capacity, creates diversified economies resilient to commodity price shocks, and creates middle classes demanding political voice and political accountability from governments. If African nations can provide universal social services, healthcare, education, water, electricity, transportation, funded by resource revenues rather than by taxation of impoverished populations or by donor aid with conditions, they achieve social sovereignty matching economic sovereignty. When Burkina Faso provides free universal healthcare funded by gold revenue, our government's legitimacy derives from delivering welfare to citizens, not from satisfying Western donors. When we provide free universal education, our human capital development proceeds according to our curriculum priorities, teaching African history and African languages and African values, not according to donor priorities, emphasizing Western history and Western languages and Western values. When we provide electricity to every household, our development metrics reflect population welfare, not export earnings or GDP growth that can increase while populations suffer. Social sovereignty creates political independence because governments serving populations enjoy legitimacy, enabling them to resist external pressure, while governments serving donors lack legitimacy, making them vulnerable to coups and protests when populations recognize that governments prioritize foreign interests over national welfare.